We sing Ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est. Where there is charity and love, there is God. So does this mean that when charity and love are hard to come by, does this mean that God has gone silent, gone into hiding, or even that God does not exist at all? Two of the most profound stories I know that describe the experience of God's silence in a person's religious life are that of Elie Wiesel, a Romanian-born Jew who survived 2 Holocaust concentration camps, and Mother Teresa, a Catholic nun who served the poor in the slums of Calcutta. In his book, Night, Wiesel tells the story of his imprisonment in the Auschwitz and Buchenwald concentration camps. He recounts horrifying stories of his father being beaten, of children being killed in front of him, of the series of moments which, he wrote, murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. In this book, he grapples with how God could do or say nothing in the face of the suffering that he experienced there. He vowed to protest this silence by refusing to remain silent himself about injustice. At one point in Night, he engages in an act of resistance by defying his Yom Kippur fast, saying, "There was no longer reason for me to fast. I no longer accepted God's silence." And Mother Teresa, someone lifted up as exemplifying the spirit of love and charity, experienced the silence of God herself in the form of a deep spiritual emptiness and doubt that lasted for at least the last 50 years of her life. She wrote many letters to friends and spiritual advisors about her struggles, but was never able to resolve them completely. She requested that these letters be destroyed, but they were compiled after her death in 1997 into a book, Mother Teresa, Come Be My Light, offering a view into the inner struggle behind the saintly persona. She wrote to a friend, "Where I try to raise my thoughts to heaven, there is such convicting emptiness that those very thoughts return like sharp knives and cut into my very soul." In another letter she wrote, "I am told God lives in me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul." She couldn't connect with God in or around her. Have you ever had a crisis of faith, or what some call a dark night of the soul? A time when what you thought was true did not hold up? Or a time when you felt alone with no help in a time of suffering? A time when you received no discernible answer to your prayers? A time when your guiding North Star, the source of direction and hope, seemed to go dark? I have, certainly not as intensely as Elie Wiesel or Mother Teresa, but there have been times in my life when I struggled with what was happening, when I questioned what I should do, and I found no ready assurance or easy answers. I should say that when I speak of the silence of God, what I mean by God is not an anthropomorphic being that speaks to us or stays silent, but the word God points towards something, an ultimate value towards which we orient our lives. So when we find ourselves disconnected from that orienting force, without a chart and compass, as our forebears here at First Unitarian Church put it, it is sometimes experienced as a crisis of faith. I imagine that this kind of spiritual struggle is familiar to some here in this sanctuary, which is why for the next 3 weeks in worship, as we make our way through the season of Lent, we're delving into some of these experiences. This is a season of facing our humanity and cultivating practices that help to better connect us with ourselves and with one another and with the holy. We ask theological questions like, what do we do when God is silent? Or why does God stay silent in the face of suffering? Or even, is there a God at all? Is there some source of assurance, help, and hope that I can count on? These questions are asked again and again in the Bible, particularly in the Hebrew Scriptures, and you heard a couple of those stories as our readings this morning. The Psalm of Job, written by the Reverend Barbara Peskin, is a midrash on the ancient story of Job. He was a wealthy man who was made to suffer in order to test his goodness. Was he good because he lived a life of abundance, or was he good at his core? His livestock, servants, and children were all killed, and he was afflicted with sores on the bottom of his feet. He suffered and lamented. He said, "I cry out to you, O God, but you do not answer." Even though God was silent, Job never stopped seeking God and demanding answers. In the end, God did speak to Job and restored everything to him, assured of his goodness. He said, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." In Peskin's psalm, she talks of seeing God in the good and gentle things, as well as in the suffering and the pain. She rages and calls out God's name, demanding an answer, and the answer is more silence. She cannot turn her eyes from signs of God all around her, and yet God feels absent, there in name only. The story of Elijah contains similar themes. As a prophet, Elijah feared for his life under the rule of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, so he fled to the desert. There he complained to God that his efforts to bring the Israelites back to God were unsuccessful, and he was told to go out and stand on a mountain and wait for God to appear. First there was the great wind, but God wasn't in the wind, and the earthquake, but God wasn't there either. Then there was the fire, and God wasn't in the fire. But what followed the fire was the sound of sheer silence. He was waiting for God's answer, and it came in the form of sheer silence. In other versions of this passage, a sound of sheer silence is translated as a still small voice. God wasn't in the wind or the fire, but God wasn't entirely silent either. What seemed like silence or inactivity was actually an opportunity for Elijah to listen to the still small voice and to recognize that he wasn't alone there standing up on that mountain. And at the end of the passage, we hear that Elijah had an army of 7,000 waiting in the wings to join him. The last part is really important. Elijah lamented the silence of God, but what that silence helped him to find was that he had others nearby who could offer him support. When it seems like God is silent, let us look to our surroundings for help and assurance. Silence is not necessarily the absence of the holy, but it is an opening to find what we need within or around us. In one of the many heart-wrenching scenes from Elie Wiesel's book, Night, there is a public hanging of two men and a child, as a crowd, including Wiesel, looks on. Behind him, he hears a man cry out, "For God's sake, where is God?" "From within me," writes Wiesel, "I heard a voice answer, 'Where is he?' This is where, hanging here from these gallows." From the still small voice that came to him in that moment, he realized that God was suffering alongside him in the concentration camp. And in a way, that brought him some assurance, and it helped him to survive the horrors of his imprisonment. In my office here at church, I have a quote posted above my desk from the Reverend Rebecca Parker that says, "There is a love holding me. There is a love holding you. There is a love holding us all. I rest in this love." And this is another answer to those questions about the absence or presence of a source of help and hope. While some religious people expect and believe that God intervenes in human affairs, I don't think that the response to my prayers is a direct one from God or something out there. The response is something that happens within me, in the silent sanctuary of my heart. Rumi, the Sufi Muslim poet, wrote in one of his poems, "Silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation." So if silence is the language of God, then we must become translators of the spirit of love and hope and help in hard times. As Unitarian Universalists, we know God by many names and many voices and many symbols. And we must learn to listen deeply to the silence, to translate it. And what we discover may be an answer to our prayers and to our questions. And if the silence of God is not synonymous with the absence of God, we must also reframe the question at the foundation of this spiritual struggle. And for this I turn to the words of the Reverend Charlie Ortman, who wisely stated, "The question is not whether or not there is a God, nor would I add as the question, why did God let X happen? The question is, are we able to unburden our hearts when we are in pain? Are we able to give thanks when we are grateful? Are we able to articulate our smallness within the vastness of this magnificent universe in which we have our being?" One of the ways that we do this, the way that we lay down the burden of pain, give thanks, and express awe, is through prayer. And when I say prayer, I am speaking from my heart. When I pray, it is paying attention to that still small voice that emerges from the silence and voicing that in words or in song. Making the connection between the silence and the heart, though, is what people like Mother Teresa have struggled with. And honestly, I struggle with it sometimes too. Like many of us, Mother Teresa spoke wise truths, but seemed to have a hard time always internalizing them or making them true for herself. She once said, "God cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is the friend of silence. See how nature, trees, flowers, grass, grows in silence. See the stars, the moon, and the sun, how they move in silence." And yet this silence and practices such as prayer and the Eucharist left her feeling spiritually empty rather than closer to God. We live in a noisy world, full of whirlwinds and earthquakes and fire, but none of these things can offer the answers to our deepest questions and hopes and prayers. Only silence can. So when we feel alone, without help, without answers, without a guiding star to shine our way, we have to create space for silence and welcome it rather than fear it. We have to bring to bear our sharpest spiritual tools to translate, make meaning, and find in the silence the love, assurance, and support we seek. So when you find yourself lamenting the silence of God or wondering how injustice could run so rampant, remember that you are not alone. You have a community waiting in the wings. It may not be 7,000 strong, like in the story of Elijah, but at least several hundred here at church who are ready and willing to embody love and charity in your life, to help you discern the answers that you are seeking, to pause with you in the silence to see what emerges. Each of us can be translators of the Spirit. Ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est. May it be so. Amen.